My name is Mara Voss. I am 17 years old. I am from a small town in Montana, and I am the only human being on Velinoth Station. That last part still surprises me sometimes, late at night, when I press my back against the cold metal wall of my dorm room and listen to the hum of the life support systems running through the ceiling. It is a very specific kind of hum, deep and constant, like something breathing. I have learned to find it comforting. I have learned to find comfort in a lot of strange things since I left Earth 8 months ago. The Galactic Preparatory Institute sits in the middle ring of Velinoth Station, which is itself hanging in the dark between two quiet stars. It is not the most famous school in the known systems. It is not the most expensive. But it is one of the few institutions that accepts applications from species that have not yet completed their first interstellar expansion, which is a very long way of saying it is one of the few schools in the galaxy that will take a human. I got a scholarship, full funding, travel included, a small monthly credit for food and supplies. I applied on a dare from my older brother Eli, who said I was not brave enough to even fill out the form. I filled out the form. Then I got accepted. Then Eli cried a little, though he will never admit that, and my grandmother made me a large meal and told me to pay attention to everything and trust my instincts. My grandmother is a practical woman. She does not waste words. I paid attention to everything. I still do. The institute has 412 students this term, representing 31 different species. There are Velthari, who are tall and six-limbed, and glow faintly blue-green in the dark. There are Dren, who are wide and slow-moving, and have 4 eyes that work independently of each other. There are Sifani, who are small and communicate partly through color shifts in their skin, and whose translator chip interpretations are still not perfect, which makes their conversations feel like reading a book with certain words missing. There are others, many others. And then there is me. I stand about 168 centimeters tall. I have brown hair that I keep in a braid because the station air is dry and my hair gets into everything when I leave it loose. I have 2 arms, 2 legs, and 2 eyes that work together rather than separately, which several species here find a little unnerving, though they are polite about it. I eat in the student commons 3 times a day. I carry a worn canvas bag from home that is very out of place among the gleaming equipment cases and molded resin packs that everyone else carries. I sit, usually, in the 3rd row during lectures. Not the front row, because the front row is for students who want to be noticed, and I do not want to be noticed. Not the back row either, because the back row is for students who are not paying attention, and I am always paying attention. 3rd row, center seat, good sight lines in every direction, my grandmother would approve. The Galactic Registry, which is the enormous bureaucratic organization that catalogs and classifies everything in the known galaxy, has Earth listed as a Class 3 biosphere. Class 3 means the planet supports complex life. It means the atmosphere is breathable by a range of species. It means the ecosystem is, quote, moderately competitive. When I first read that classification on the public database, I sat with it for a while. Moderately competitive. I thought about the winter I was 12, when a mountain lion came within 4 meters of me on a trail I had walked 100 times. I thought about the river flooding behind our house when I was 9, and my father carrying me on his shoulders through water up to his chest. I thought about the way every living thing back home is always, constantly, quietly working to survive. Moderately competitive. I have decided not to correct the record. It does not help me to have people understand Earth accurately. A student who seems unremarkable is a student who gets left alone. A student who gets left alone can focus on her work. I am here to learn, to earn credits, and to go home someday with a qualification that will open doors that do not currently exist for humans. That is the plan. I am good at plans. My favorite class is Advanced Xenobiology. The professor is a Dren named Instructor Hove, and she has the rare and wonderful quality of not caring at all what species you are as long as you have done the reading. I have always done the reading. On my first assignment, I scored the highest mark in the class, which surprised Instructor Hove visibly and surprised my classmates more. The Velthari student sitting 2 rows ahead of me turned around to look at me when the scores were posted on the shared display. His name is Sevek. He did not smile. He just looked, in the way that someone looks at something they were not expecting to find where it is. I looked back. I did not smile either. Then I went back to my notes because there were still 20 minutes left in the period and I had 3 more pages to get through. That was 6 weeks ago. Since then, I have noticed Sevek noticing me more often. He sits with 2 others usually. A taller Velthari named Orithe, who moves with the kind of slow confidence that comes from never having had to hurry, and a younger one the others call Preen, who is always slightly behind the other 2, in the way that a person is slightly behind when they are trying very hard to appear to belong. They travel together through the corridors in a loose cluster. They take up more space than they need to. Other students move aside for them without being asked. I do not move aside. I pick a different route. This is not fear. I want to be clear about that. I learned a long time ago, on trails and in rivers and in weather that did not care whether I was comfortable, the difference between fear and awareness. Fear makes you freeze or run without thinking. Awareness makes you gather information and choose your next step carefully. What I feel when I see Sevek and his cluster moving through the corridors is awareness. Pure and calm and useful. They have been escalating, slowly, over the past few weeks. First it was small things, Sevek's elbow catching my tablet in advanced systems, and sending it sliding off the edge of the desk. A natural-sounding apology in his own language that my translator chip caught a half-second too late to feel genuine. The way Orothy and Preem positioned themselves in doorways just long enough that I had to slow down and wait. The conversations in the Velthari dialect that the translator chips process about 2 seconds slower than their primary language, so that by the time I understood what was said, they were already past me, and the moment was gone. None of it was something I could report. None of it was anything the Institute's conflict officer would log as an incident. It was the kind of behavior that is carefully designed to be invisible to anyone who is not the target. But I am a very observant person. I see patterns. My father taught me to track animals through Montana woodland, and the first thing he ever told me was, everything that moves leaves a pattern. You just have to be patient enough to find it. I am patient. I am very, very patient. After the advanced systems class where my tablet was knocked, I went back to my dormitory and I sat at my desk and I thought. I thought about what I knew. I thought about what I did not know. I thought about what I needed to know. Then I opened my study terminal and I spent 3 hours reading supplemental papers on Velthari social behavior, which are available in the Institute's academic database, and which apparently no one else had considered worth reading, because the access timestamp showed I was the 7th person to open those files in 2 years. I read all of them. I took careful notes in the small handwritten notebook I keep in my canvas bag, a paper notebook, from Earth. Several of my classmates have asked about it, because physical handwritten records are unusual here. I tell them it is a cultural habit. That is true. I do not tell them that a paper notebook cannot be remotely accessed, cannot be hacked, cannot have its contents transmitted across a network without someone physically taking it from me. That part I keep to myself. Some things are good to know, and better not to share. At the end of my 3rd hour of reading, I closed the database, set my notebook on my desk, and looked out the narrow viewport in my dorm room wall. The stars outside were very still and very far away. The life support system hummed. I pressed my hand against the wall and felt the faint vibration of it, steady as a heartbeat. I thought about home. I thought about the way the sky in Montana looks in November, heavy and white and close to the ground, like a ceiling being lowered slowly. I thought about how the cold never felt threatening to me, just present, just a condition to be accounted for. Then I thought about Sevek. I thought about Orith. I thought about Preen. I thought about patterns and what they tend to lead toward once you follow them far enough. I picked up my stylus and turned it slowly in my fingers. It was a standard-issue Institute writing tool, made of some light composite material, weighted well, good grip, reasonable length, a shape not entirely unlike something else, if you thought about it from a certain angle. I did not do anything with that thought. Not then. I simply held it, and breathed, and looked at the stars, and made a small, quiet decision that I would pay close attention to where the pattern led next. My grandmother always said, "You cannot control the weather. You cannot control the mountain. You can only control how well you prepare for both." I set the stylus down. I opened my xenobiology textbook. I had a midterm in 4 days and I was not going to let anyone, for any reason, stop me from being ready for it. 3rd row, center seat, both eyes forward. That was the plan. And I am very good at plans. The midterm came and went. I scored the highest mark in advanced xenobiology again. Instructor Hove handed back the results on small printed cards, walking slowly between the rows of desks, setting each card face down in front of its student without expression. When she set mine down, she paused for exactly 1 second longer than she paused at anyone else's desk. That was all. She moved on without a word. But that 1 second said something, and I tucked it away like I tuck everything away, quietly, carefully, in the part of my mind where I keep things that matter. I flipped my card over after she had passed, 97 out of 100. The 2 questions I missed were about Sifani reproductive biology, which is a subject so complicated and so layered with cultural nuance that even the textbook contradicts itself in 3 separate chapters. I was not disappointed. I circled those 2 questions on my card, wrote a small note beside each one, and decided I would spend extra time on that chapter before the final exam. Around me, other students were reacting to their scores in the particular ways that students react everywhere in the galaxy, which is to say some were quietly satisfied, some were quietly unhappy, and a few were not quiet at all. The Velthari student to my left made a sharp clicking sound with the small joints at the base of his second arm, which my cultural briefing notes told me was a sound of frustration. His score was 71. 2 rows ahead, Sevek did not make any sound at all. I watched him without watching him, which is a skill I have had since I was small. In Montana, if you look directly at a wild animal, it knows. Something in the direct line of attention triggers awareness in almost every living creature. But you can observe without focusing directly. You can use your peripheral vision. You can note posture and movement and the small shifts in how a body holds itself, without ever making eye contact. My father called it soft eyes. You look at the whole picture instead of one part of it. You let information come to you instead of reaching for it. Sevak's score, from what I could read at an angle and a distance, was 78. He sat very still after he flipped the card. Then he turned it back face down and folded his 4 upper hands on the desk in a careful, controlled way. He did not look at me, but something in the set of his shoulders changed, very slightly, in the way that a change in air pressure changes before a storm arrives. I looked back at my notes. I had 6 more chapters to review before next week. I want to explain something about Velinoth Station, because it matters for understanding everything that happened later. The station is large, genuinely large, in the way that is hard to picture until you have walked its corridors for a few weeks and realize that you have still not seen all of them. It has 11 residential rings, 4 academic rings, 2 commercial sectors, a medical wing, a transport bay, and a collection of lower levels that used to serve various industrial and mechanical purposes, and now serve mostly as storage, maintenance access, and the kind of empty space that large structures always seem to generate over time. The Institute occupies the 3rd and 4th academic rings. Students are officially permitted in those rings, in the residential rings, and in the commercial sector during specified hours. The lower levels are not on the restricted list. They are simply not on any list that most students think about. They are quiet and dim and smell of recycled air and old machinery, and there is no particular reason for a student to go down there unless that student is looking for somewhere to be alone. I found them in my 2nd week on the station. I want to be honest about why. It was not strategy, not at first. It was simply that the student commons is very full and very loud, in a way that is difficult to describe unless you have sat inside it and felt 31 different species worth of noise and movement and translated conversation pressing in on you from every side. I am not a person who minds being alone. I grew up with long stretches of quiet, with forests and open land and the particular peace of a place that does not require anything of you socially. The commons required things of me socially every minute I sat in it. So I found the maintenance corridors. I found the access hatch behind Laboratory 7 that most people do not notice because it is painted the same gray as the wall around it, and the handle requires a specific upward then sideways motion that is not obvious unless you have spent time figuring it out. I figured it out in about 4 minutes, which is the kind of thing that happens when you grow up learning to open latches and gates and stubborn old barn doors that have swollen in the cold. Beyond the hatch is a corridor, and beyond the corridor is a ladder, and beyond the ladder is Sublevel 9. Sublevel 9 is a decommissioned cargo bay. It is about the size of 3 institute classrooms placed end to end, with high ceilings and old loading equipment pushed to the walls and the kind of heavy silence that only exists in rooms that have not been used in a long time. The emergency lighting runs on a low setting, casting everything in a dim amber glow. The floor is solid alloy plating, cool underfoot, with the faint textured pattern of cargo grip strips running in parallel lines from one end to the other. I liked it immediately. I started going there in the evenings, after dinner and before the late study period. I would sit with my back against the far wall, my paper notebook on my knee, and I would simply be quiet for a while. Sometimes I read, sometimes I went through my notes. Sometimes I did nothing at all except breathe and listen to the deep hum of the station's systems running in the walls around me, which down there was much louder than in the dormitory, a low and steady vibration that I could feel through the floor and the wall and the soles of my feet. It was on one of those evenings about 3 weeks into my routine that I began to properly map the space. I did it because it was interesting, and because I have a habit, which my brother Eli always called excessive, and which I have always called sensible, of learning the shape of any place I spend time in. Where the exits are, where the narrow points are, where the ceiling is lower and where it opens up, what the floor is made of and whether it is even or not, how sound travels, where the shadows are deepest. My father taught me this on every trail we ever walked together, and eventually it stopped being something I did on purpose and became simply how I see any room I enter. Sublevel 9 has 3 exits. The main one is the large cargo door on the north wall, which has been sealed and does not open from the inside without a specific override code. The second is the ladder access I use, on the east wall. The third is a narrow service passage on the west wall, about shoulder width, that runs for approximately 30 meters before connecting to a different maintenance corridor. I walked it twice, measured it in paces, and noted that it curves slightly left at the halfway point, which would be important to remember if you ever needed to move through it quickly and quietly. I noted all of this in my paper notebook and then went back to studying xenobiology. Now I need to tell you about the Velthari, because Sevek and Orethi and Preen are Velthari, and understanding them matters. The Velthari are, by any reasonable measure, a remarkable species. They evolved on a world with relatively low environmental pressure, which means their planet was not particularly dangerous during the long stretch of time when their intelligence was developing. Their predators were manageable. Their climate was stable. Their food sources were reliable. As a result, they did not develop the particular kind of urgent, problem-solving, deeply practical intelligence that comes from spending millions of years in a world that is actively trying to stop you from surviving. Instead, they developed social intelligence, complex hierarchy systems, subtle communication, an extremely refined sense of status and where every individual in a group sits within it. They are, in the language that my xenobiology supplemental papers used, a socially dominant species that measures success primarily through relative position rather than absolute achievement, which means that Sevek does not simply want to do well. Sevek wants to do better than everyone around him, and when someone around him does better than he does, the Velthari social instinct does not respond with admiration or motivation. It responds with a drive to correct the imbalance. I read all of this in those 3 hours after my tablet was knocked off my desk. I read it carefully, the way I read everything I consider important. I underlined nothing, because I had my notebook. I wrote down what mattered in my own words, which is a better way to learn than underlining anyway, because it makes you translate the information through your own understanding before you store it. What I wrote, at the bottom of one page, in small and ordinary handwriting was this: they respond to perceived imbalance. The response escalates if the imbalance continues. It follows a pattern. Patterns can be anticipated. Then I closed my notebook and went to sleep. The behavior continued over the following weeks. I documented it the same way I documented everything, without emotion, with precision. The tablet incident, the doorway blocking, which happened 4 times. A moment in the food line when Oreth leaned across me to reach something, moving into my space in a way that was too deliberate to be accidental. The Velthari dialect conversations that were timed, I became certain, so that the punchline of whatever was said arrived in my translator chip half a second after they had already moved away. Each time, I did nothing visible. I moved around the blockage. I stepped back from Orethi's arm. I let the late translation arrive and kept my face neutral. I went on with my day, but I wrote it all down. Dates, times, locations, descriptions. My paper notebook, which cannot be accessed remotely. My handwriting, which is small and neat and has been compared by more than one person to the handwriting of someone who is being very careful. I am always being very careful. One afternoon, about a week after the midterm, I was in the corridor outside the Advanced Systems Lab, waiting for the previous session to clear out before our class began. I was standing against the wall reading ahead in my course materials on my tablet. The corridor was moderately busy, students moving past in both directions, the ambient noise of translated conversation and footsteps, and the general business of an academic institution going about its day. Sevek appeared from a side corridor with Orethi and Preen behind him. They were not heading to Advanced Systems. They were simply there, suddenly, in the way that things appear when they have been placed deliberately. Sevek stopped beside me. He was taller than me by about a head, and his bioluminescence was running a steady blue, which I knew from my reading indicated a calm and controlled emotional state. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then he leaned slightly closer, which reduced the distance between us to about half of what is considered comfortable in the social norms of most species on the station. His translator chip rendered what he said in a flat, even tone, the way translator chips always do, without the inflection that changes the meaning of words. But I had been studying inflection patterns from my reading, and I had a reasonable sense of what the original tone was. He said, "Deathworld is a myth. You are just soft meat with a dramatic homeworld." I looked at him. I held eye contact for exactly 3 seconds, which is long enough to be deliberate and short enough to be unreadable. Then I looked back at my tablet. I said, "Interesting perspective." He waited, I think, for something more, some reaction, some shift in my posture or expression that would tell him the words had landed the way he intended. I gave him nothing, not because I was forcing myself to be calm. I was calm. I was genuinely, completely calm, in the way that a river is calm on the surface when the current underneath is doing all the work. After a moment, he straightened up. He and Orethi and Preen moved on down the corridor. Preen glanced back at me once. I had already returned to my reading. The advanced systems class that followed was one of my better sessions. I answered 2 questions the professor directed at the group, both correctly, and I completed the practical component 6 minutes before the end of the period, and used the remaining time to start on the next module. When the bell tone sounded and students began to pack up, I gathered my things at my own pace and filed out without hurrying. That evening I went to sub-level 9. I sat against the far wall with my notebook on my knee, and the amber emergency lighting making long soft shadows across the cargo grip strips on the floor. The station hummed around me. I could feel it in my spine, steady and low, like something breathing. I opened my notebook to a fresh page. At the top I wrote the date and the time. Then I wrote, in my small, careful handwriting, a summary of what Sevek had said and what I had observed, the words he used, the position he took up, the way Orethi and Preen spread slightly to the sides in a way that was not quite casual, the duration of his pause before he moved on. I stared at what I had written for a while. Then I wrote one more line, below the summary, separated from it by a small space. It said, "The escalation phase has begun. I have tracked animals in Montana woodland in every season. I know what it looks like when something shifts from general movement into a directed pattern. I know what it looks like when something that was circling begins to close in. I know the difference between a creature that is curious and a creature that has made a decision. Sevek had made a decision. I did not know yet exactly what that decision was, but the pattern was clear enough, and I have always trusted patterns over assumptions. I closed my notebook. I pressed my back against the cool metal wall and breathed slowly, and looked at the ceiling of sub-level 9, where a single strip of emergency lighting ran from one end to the other like a line drawn by a careful hand. I thought about my grandmother's kitchen in November, the smell of it, the way she moved around it without wasting a single motion, because she had spent 60 years learning exactly where everything was, and exactly what she needed to do. She used to say that the most dangerous thing a person could be was underestimated by someone who meant them harm. Not because being underestimated was dangerous in itself, but because people who underestimate you stop being careful, and people who stop being careful make mistakes. She also used to say, "Know your ground before you need it." I already knew my ground. I had known it for 3 weeks. I had walked every exit, measured every shadow, noted every surface and angle, and the way sound moved in this space. I knew sub-level 9 the way I knew the trails behind our house in Montana, which is to say I knew it in my feet and my hands and the back of my mind where things get stored without being asked. I stood up. I walked the length of the cargo bay once, slowly, in the amber light, feeling the grip strips under my shoes, noting the weight of the air and the direction of the ventilation current from the grating on the east wall. I stopped at the entrance to the narrow service passage on the west side, and looked down its 30 meters of shadow. I noted, again, the slight left curve at the halfway point. Then I went back to my dormitory, brushed my teeth, and went to bed. I had classes in the morning, and I intended to be well rested. Whatever was coming, I was going to be ready for it. That was not bravado. That was not the kind of bold feeling that gets people into trouble. It was simply a fact, the same kind of fact as the temperature outside or the score on an exam. Things either are or they are not. I either would be ready or I would not. I would be. I turned off the light. The station hummed. I closed my eyes and thought about nothing in particular until I fell asleep, which did not take long. It never does, when I have already done everything I can do for the day. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes before something changes. I have felt it before. Standing at the edge of a frozen lake in January, watching the surface, knowing from the sound the ice makes underfoot that the safe path is narrower than it looks. Sitting in a deer blind before dawn, when the forest has gone completely still and every animal in it seems to be holding its breath for the same reason, waiting for the same thing. It is not a dramatic feeling. It does not arrive with any warning or any obvious sign. It is simply a quality of the air, a pressure change so small that most people would not notice it at all. I noticed it on a Tuesday morning, 2 days after Sevek said what he said in the corridor outside Advanced Systems. I was at breakfast in the student commons, sitting at my usual spot at the end of the long east table where the light from the viewport is good and the nearest other occupied seats are far enough away to be comfortable. I had my notebook open beside my tray, and I was reviewing my materials for the day while I ate. The commons was filling up around me. The usual noise of a few hundred students beginning their morning, translated conversations layering over each other in the way they always do, creating a general sound that is not quite any single language but is somehow all of them at once. I was not looking at anything in particular. I was doing what I do, which is keep my attention on my work while also keeping a general, unfocused awareness of the room around me. Soft eyes, the way my father taught me. Sevek, Orithe, and Preen came in together, as they always did. They collected their trays from the service line and moved toward their usual table in the center of the room, which is the table that the Velthari social cluster has occupied every morning for what I understood to be the past 2 full terms. It is the most central table, the one with the best view of the entire commons. The one that says, without any words, that the people sitting at it consider themselves the center of the room. I watched them without watching them. They sat down. They arranged themselves in their usual configuration, Sevek in the center position with Orith to his left, and Preen to his right. They began to eat. They talked in their own dialect, low and quick, the translator chips in the room lagging slightly on the speed of it. Ordinary morning behavior. Ordinary enough that I almost looked away. But then Sevek said something to Orithe, and Orithe turned his head and looked directly at me. Not the sideways, considering kind of look that I had become used to over the past several weeks. A direct look, a measuring look, the kind of look that is not casual and does not pretend to be. I held my eyes on my notebook. Orithe turned back to Sevek. They continued talking. After a moment, Preen leaned in, and the 3 of them were close together over the table in the configuration of people sharing something they do not want overheard. The feeling I described, that particular quiet pressure, settled more firmly in my chest. I finished my breakfast. I closed my notebook. I picked up my tray, returned it to the collection station, and walked out of the commons at my normal pace. I did not hurry. I did not look back. But as I walked away, I was thinking very clearly and very quickly. The way I think when something that has been developing in the background suddenly requires more of my attention. I went to my first class of the day, which was Applied Systems Theory, with a Sifani instructor, whose name my translator chip always renders as something close to Professor Vel, though I understood that is not quite right. I sat in my usual seat. I took my usual notes. I answered when asked. I was present and attentive in every way that a student is supposed to be present and attentive. And in the part of my mind that runs underneath all of that, I was thinking about Orithe's look. Not the fact of the look itself, but the timing of it. It had come directly after Sevek said something, which meant it was a response to information rather than an independent action. Orithe had looked at me because Sevek had directed him to, which meant Sevek was coordinating, planning something together, the 3 of them, that required knowing where I was and what I was doing at a specific moment. I had seen that kind of coordination before, not in any alien species, in people, back home, in the particular way that a group of people who have decided to do something behave differently around the subject of that decision, even when they are trying to appear normal. There is a quality to deliberate normality that is slightly different from actual normality, in the same way that a smile that is being performed is slightly different from a smile that simply happens. Most people cannot identify the difference. They just feel, sometimes, that something is slightly off, without knowing why. I always know why. I pay attention to the details that add up to the feeling, rather than just feeling it and leaving the reasoning unexplored. By the time Applied Systems Theory ended, and I collected my things and moved into the corridor, I had a clear and settled understanding of 2 things. The first was that Sevek was planning something that involved me specifically. The second was that I needed more information before I could understand what that something was. I got it that evening, entirely by accident, which is the honest version of the story. I would like to say I engineered it. I would like to say I positioned myself deliberately, because it would make me sound more impressively strategic. But the truth is that I went to Sublevel 9 because I wanted to be quiet for a while, and I went through the maintenance corridor because that is the route I always take, and I came through the access hatch and started down the ladder, because that is what I do every evening I go there. And Sevek, Orithe, and Preen were already inside. I heard them before I saw them. The ladder access comes down the east wall of the cargo bay, behind a large piece of old loading equipment that sits against the wall there, and the angle of descent means that when you come down the ladder you are briefly behind that equipment and not visible to anyone in the main space of the bay. I heard voices, the distinctive tonal quality of the Velthari dialect, quick and layered, and I stopped with my feet 2 rungs from the floor. I did not move. I controlled my breathing, slow and even, through my nose, making no sound. The loading equipment in front of me was metal and solid and gave nothing away. I was behind it and below the line of sight from the center of the room. I was essentially invisible. My translator chip was running. I listened. They were not being particularly quiet. This was, I understood immediately, because they believed they were alone. They had used the cargo door on the north wall, which I had not known could be opened from outside without the override code, but which apparently Sevek had arranged access to through someone he knew on the maintenance crew. This was useful information. I noted it and kept listening. Sevek was speaking mostly. His tone was the tone of someone giving instructions, explaining something to people who were following, rather than contributing equally to the plan. I had enough familiarity with Velthari inflection by now to read the basic emotional quality of it, if not every specific word, and the specific words my translator chip was catching were enough to fill in most of what I missed. They were going to use this space, sub-level 9, the decommissioned cargo bay that I had been coming to every evening for 3 weeks, and that they had apparently identified as a location that suited their purposes. Their purposes, as I pieced them together from what I was hearing in fragments and translations, were what the Velthari supplemental papers I had read called a Velthari hunt. I knew what that was. I had read the section twice, because it was one of those pieces of cultural information that I had felt, at the time, was important to understand fully. The Velthari hunt is an old Velthari tradition, going back to their pre-expansion period, when the species was still organized in the clan-based hierarchy structures that preceded their current society. In its original form, it was a test of dominance within a clan group, where a senior member would pursue a junior member through a natural environment as a way of establishing or reinforcing the social order. The junior member who escaped or lasted longest gained respect. The one who did not was expected to accept a lower position permanently. In its modern form, which the papers described with the careful neutral language of academic writing, it had evolved into something used primarily against outsiders. Against individuals who were not part of the Velthari social group but who had, in some way, created an imbalance that the group found unacceptable. An outsider who scored higher on an exam. An outsider who did not move aside in corridors. An outsider who responded to a deliberately cutting remark with 2 words and a level gaze, and absolutely nothing else. The purpose was not injury, the papers said. The purpose was submission. The chase, the pursuit, the experience of being hunted through an enclosed space, was intended to produce fear and helplessness in the target, which would then translate into permanent deference. The target would know, afterward, what it felt like to be entirely without power, and that knowledge was supposed to reorder them, put them back in the position the social structure demanded they occupy. Sevek said something that my chip caught cleanly and completely, and I want to be precise about what it was, because it matters. He said, if it cannot be found afterward, the station will record it as an environmental incident. They do not investigate losses of Deathworld creatures. The registry does not consider them a significant resource. There was a pause. Then Orithus said something in agreement. Then Preen, in the slightly higher tone of someone who is younger and trying to sound more certain than they feel, said something that my chip translated as, when do we do it? Sevek said, after advanced systems, tomorrow. Then they talked about the route they would use. The cargo door access. How Preen would move to the east side to block the ladder. How Orith would take the center. How Sevek himself would come in from the north through the cargo door, once the others had moved me away from the exit points. He described it the way someone describes something they have thought about carefully and feel confident about. He had thought about it carefully, I could tell. The plan was not careless. It used the space well, cut off the obvious exits, used the numerical advantage correctly. The problem was that he had not mapped the space as carefully as I had. He did not know about the service passage on the west wall. I know that because he did not mention it. In his description of how they would position themselves and how the space would be controlled, the west wall simply did not feature. It was a blank, a place on the map where his attention had not gone, probably because the passage entrance is narrow and set back slightly into a shallow alcove, and in the amber emergency lighting it is very easy to walk past it without registering that it is there. I had found it on my 3rd visit to sub-level 9. I had measured it in paces and noted the left curve at the halfway point. I had walked it twice, once quickly and once slowly, and I knew exactly how long it took, and exactly what the floor felt like underfoot, and exactly where you had to angle your shoulders to fit through the narrowest section, which is about 2/3 of the way along. I stood on the ladder, 2 rungs from the floor, and breathed slowly through my nose, and I listened to the rest of what they said, which was mostly details about timing and positioning that I filed away without emotion, the way I file everything. Then they left through the cargo door, and the bay went quiet, and the amber emergency lighting settled back over the empty space like something exhaling. I came down the last 2 rungs and stood on the cargo bay floor. I stood there for a long time, not because I was afraid, not because I did not know what to do, I stood there because I was being precise, the way I am always precise, making sure that what I understood about the situation was actually what the situation was, rather than what I wanted it to be or feared it was. This is the most important discipline I know. It is very easy, when something frightening is happening, to start filling in gaps with your emotions instead of your observations. My father called it seeing the bear that is not there. You hear a sound in the dark and your mind gives it a shape before your eyes can find it, and the shape your mind gives it is always bigger and closer than the real thing. I did not want to see any bears that were not there. I wanted to see exactly, and only, what was actually in front of me. What was actually in front of me was this. 3 individuals had made a plan to use this space, tomorrow evening after advanced systems class, to frighten me in a deliberate and organized way. One of them had said something that, when translated precisely and without softening, meant that they would not be troubled if I was not found afterward. I thought about that for a moment. I let it sit in my mind without reacting to it, the way you let a fire sit before you decide what to do about it. Then I thought about something else. I thought about the fact that this cargo bay was a place I had been coming to for 3 weeks. A place I had mapped. A place I knew in the particular deep way that you only know somewhere when you have been there often and quietly and paid attention. I thought about the service passage on the west wall and the 30 meters of shadow and the slight left curve at the halfway point. I thought about the 3 exits and which ones they knew about and which one they did not. I thought about everything my grandmother ever told me about not being where something dangerous expects you to be. Then I did something that I think might surprise people, if they expected me to start making urgent preparations or running through dramatic strategies. I sat down against the far wall, in my usual spot, with my notebook on my knee. And I thought, slowly, carefully, without rushing, I thought through everything I knew. I am good at thinking under pressure. Earth made me good at it. Not Montana specifically, though Montana helped. Earth in general made me good at it. Every living thing on that planet has spent millions of years developing the particular skills it needs to keep existing, and the skill that humans developed better than almost anything else in the known galaxy, though the registry's Class 3 classification does not mention it, is the ability to think clearly about a problem when the stakes of the problem are very high. We plan, we prepare. We think several steps ahead and then several steps beyond that. We imagine every version of what might happen, and we work through each one. Not with panic, but with the particular focused calm of a species that learned, very early in its history, that the universe does not reward the dramatic gesture nearly as much as it rewards the well-considered move. I spent an hour in Sub-Level 9 that evening. When I left, my notebook had 6 new pages in it, written in small and careful handwriting, and I had a clear and complete picture in my mind of exactly what I intended to do. I climbed the ladder, moved through the maintenance corridor, came back up through the access hatch behind Laboratory 7, and walked to the dormitory at my normal pace. I stopped at the dormitory supply room on the way, and borrowed several items that were available for general student use. A portable lighting tool, a length of utility cord, the kind used for securing equipment during transport, a standard maintenance kit that contained, among other things, several tools in various sizes, and a plasma conduit cover of the type that sits in racks along every maintenance corridor on the station, and is replaced routinely enough that one missing from a lower-level rack would not be noticed or logged. I carried them back to my room in my canvas bag. I sat at my desk and I organized them carefully. I thought about each one. I thought about what I knew and what the morning would bring, and what would come after advanced systems tomorrow. Then I did my regular evening study. 2 hours, same as always. I reviewed the next chapter of xenobiology and made notes. I went through my applied systems theory materials and flagged 3 questions to ask Professor Vell at the next opportunity. I checked my assignment schedule and confirmed that I had nothing due in the next 3 days, which was convenient. At 10 o'clock I got ready for bed. Before I turned off the light, I opened my notebook to the 6 new pages and read through what I had written one more time. Not because I had forgotten any of it, because there is value in reading your own thinking back to yourself, in hearing it with a slight distance, the way you hear your own voice differently when it comes from somewhere outside you. It held up. The thinking was good. The plan was solid. I closed the notebook. I put it in my canvas bag along with the items from the supply room. I turned off the light. Outside the viewport, the stars were steady and very still and burning across distances that made everything happening on this small station feel very small indeed, which is either a frightening thought or a calming one, depending on how you look at it. I have always found it calming. I closed my eyes. I breathed slowly. The station hummed around me, deep and constant, as always. Tomorrow, after advanced systems, I would be ready. I was already ready. I fell asleep in less than 5 minutes, which is the most honest measure I know of whether I have done everything I could do for the day. I had. I woke up before my alarm. This is not unusual for me. I have woken up before my alarm for most of my life because growing up on a working property in Montana means that the day begins when the day begins, not when a device tells you it has. My body learned early that lying in bed past the moment of waking is a habit that costs you, slowly, in ways you do not notice until you are already behind. So I wake up when I wake up, and I get up, and I begin. That morning I lay still for exactly 1 minute, not because I needed to, because I wanted to run through the day in my mind before I moved through it in my body. This is something my grandmother does every morning. She told me once that a day you have already walked through in your head is a day with fewer surprises, and that fewer surprises means more energy saved for the surprises you could not predict. She is a very practical woman. I have said that before. I will probably say it again. I walked through the day in my mind. Morning routine. Breakfast. Applied systems theory at the first bell. A free period. Lunch. Advanced xenobiology. Then advanced systems, which ran until the third station bell of the afternoon. And then, after that, whatever came next. I thought about whatever came next for a moment. I examined it the way you examine a tool before you use it, checking that every part is in the right place and working the way it should. Then I set it aside, because the morning still had to happen before the afternoon, and giving too much attention to what comes later at the expense of what is in front of you is a way of tripping over your own feet. I got up. I went through my morning routine. I was careful and thorough about it, the same as always. Clean clothes, braided hair, canvas bag with notebook and tablet and the items I had collected from the supply room the night before, wrapped in a spare shirt so they did not shift around when I moved. I checked the bag twice. Everything was where it should be. I went to breakfast. I sat at my usual spot. I ate my usual meal. I kept my notebook open beside my tray and reviewed my applied systems theory materials for the first period, the same as any other morning. Sevek, Orithe, and Preen came in together, the same as any other morning. They collected their trays. They went to their central table. They sat in their usual positions. They ate and talked in their own dialect, the same as always. The only difference, small enough that most people would not have noticed it, was that Sevek did not look in my direction once during the entire meal. Not a sideways glance. Not the measuring look that Oritha had given me the day before. Nothing. When someone who has been watching you stops watching you, it usually means one of two things. Either they have lost interest, or they have already decided what they are going to do and no longer need to gather information. I knew which one this was. I ate my breakfast and read my notes and did not look at them either. Applied systems theory went well. I asked the 3 questions I had flagged the night before, and Professor Vell answered 2 of them fully, and said that the third was actually the subject of ongoing academic debate, and gave me 3 papers to read, which I appreciated. I wrote the paper titles in my notebook and added them to my study list. Even in the middle of everything else, the work mattered. It has always mattered. That was why I was here. I was not going to let anything change that. The free period I spent in the library, reading ahead. Not the supplemental papers on alien biology this time. The course materials for the next 2 weeks, which I had been meaning to get to and had not yet managed because the supplemental papers had taken more of my evening time than expected. I read for the full period without stopping, and when the bell tone signaled the end of it, I had covered most of what I needed and felt the particular satisfaction that comes from being further ahead than you were an hour ago. Lunch was unremarkable. I sat at my usual spot. I ate quickly because I was not very hungry, which sometimes happens before something significant. Not from nervousness but from the way the body redistributes its attention when it knows something important is coming. I drank plenty of water, which matters more than food in those situations. Advanced xenobiology was excellent. Instructor Hovey introduced a new section on Dren adaptive physiology that connected directly to 2 of the supplemental papers I had read 3 weeks ago, and the satisfaction of having information arrive that you already know, from a direction that confirms you were right to seek it out, is one of my favorite feelings. I took detailed notes. I added 3 more questions to my ongoing list. When the period ended, I filed out with the other students, walked to the small restroom alcove near the Laboratory 7 corridor, and spent 4 minutes there alone. I did not need to use the facilities. I needed 4 minutes of complete quiet to make the final check that I always make before something important. I stood at the sink and looked at my own face and the polished metal surface above it, which serves as a mirror in the way that polished metal always does, showing you something close to your reflection but with less detail than actual glass. I could see my eyes and the general shape of my face and the line of my braid over my shoulder. I breathed. slow and even. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way my father taught me before difficult things when I was young. I was steady. My hands were steady, my thinking was clear and organized and available to me in the way that good thinking is available when you have prepared properly and rested properly, and not spent your energy on fear before the moment that requires it. I picked up my canvas bag. I walked out of the alcove and toward Advanced Systems. Advanced Systems is taught by a Dren instructor named Instructor Bevath, who is methodical and thorough, and covers the material at a pace that most students find demanding, and that I find comfortable. It is a technical course, dealing with the underlying engineering principles of station and ship systems, and I am good at it because I grew up understanding that machines are honest, they follow rules, they do what physics requires them to do, and if something is not working, the reason is always somewhere in the gap between what should be happening and what is. Finding that gap is a matter of attention and logic, not guesswork. I sat in my usual seat. I took my usual notes. The period was 2 hours long. For the first hour and 40 minutes, I gave it my full attention. This was not a performance. The work deserved my full attention, and I gave it, because that is what I do. I answered when asked. I completed the practical component. I checked my work twice. With 20 minutes remaining in the period, I allowed a small part of my attention to shift to the room itself. Not to any individual in it, just the room, the layout, the distance to the door, the number of students currently between my seat and the exit, the position of Sevek, who was 3 rows ahead and 2 seats to the left, and who had not turned around once during the entire 2 hours. The position of Orith, who was near the window on the far side of the room. The position of Preen, who was close to the door. I noted all of this without adjusting my posture or my expression. When the third station bell sounded, I did not move immediately. I let the general shuffle of students gathering their things happen around me, and I packed my own bag with my usual care, which is slower than the way most students pack because I put things back in specific places so I always know where they are without having to look. The xenobiology notes in the front pocket, the applied systems materials in the main compartment, my notebook on top, accessible without opening the bag fully. By the time I stood up, about a third of the class had already left through the main door. Sevek and Oritha had not moved yet. Preen had gone to the door but stopped just past it, in the corridor, in the particular way that someone stops when they are waiting for something rather than going somewhere. I picked up my bag. I nodded to the student next to me, who was a Safani, named something my chip rendered as close to Res, and who had once lent me a stylus when mine ran out of charge, and to whom I intended to return the favor at some point. Then I walked toward the door at my normal pace. In the corridor, I turned right. This was not the direction of my dormitory. It was not the direction of the student commons or the library or any of the places a student typically goes after the last class of the afternoon. Turning right out of Advanced Systems leads toward the maintenance sector of the 4th academic ring, which most students have no reason to go to and therefore do not. I had a reason. I heard them behind me. Not immediately. About 30 seconds after I turned right, which meant they had needed a moment to collect themselves and follow, which meant Preen had needed to signal the others that I was moving. I did not look back. I did not need to. The acoustics of the corridor, which I had studied on the several occasions I had walked it before today, tell you a great deal about what is behind you if you know how to listen. 3 sets of footsteps. The particular sound of Velthari movement is slightly different from most species because they have 6 limbs and use 4 of them for locomotion in their natural gait, though in the institute corridors they typically move in a more upright posture that uses only the lower 2, the way most bipedal species do. It is a heavier step than it might otherwise be, given their height and mass. 3 sets. Keeping pace. Not hurrying yet, because I was not hurrying. I kept my pace steady and walked toward the maintenance sector access. I want to explain something about what I was feeling at this moment, because I think it is important to be honest about it. People sometimes imagine, when they hear about someone in a difficult situation who remained calm, that the calm was the absence of feeling, that there was nothing happening inside, just a kind of empty steadiness. That is not what calm is, and that is not what I was experiencing. I was aware of the 3 sets of footsteps behind me with every part of my body. I was aware of the distance between me and the maintenance access point, which I had walked 3 times in the past week and knew in my feet without counting steps. I was aware of the weight of my canvas bag on my shoulder and the specific items inside it and what each of them was for. I was aware of my own heartbeat, which was elevated but not racing, the way a heartbeat is when the body is ready rather than frightened. The difference between ready and frightened is a very important difference. Fear spends your energy before you need it. Readiness saves it for the moment that requires it. I was ready, which meant I had everything I was going to need, right when I was going to need it. The maintenance sector access is a wide junction where the academic ring meets the service infrastructure of the station. There are several corridors branching from it, and the lighting is slightly dimmer than in the main academic corridors, because the maintenance sector runs on a lower lighting setting to conserve energy during periods of low activity. I know all of the corridors that branch from the junction. I have walked every one of them. I did not take the most obvious one. I took the third on the left, which leads to a secondary maintenance corridor that most people would not choose because it is narrower and less direct. But less direct was useful to me right now, because less direct meant that from the junction, you could not see where the third left corridor led, which meant that anyone following me into the junction would need to choose which corridor I had taken, and would choose wrong at least once before they chose right. I moved quickly once I was in the third left corridor, because I was now out of sight, and speed was no longer something I needed to conceal. I walked fast, not running, because running on corridor floors when you are carrying a bag produces sounds that travel, and I did not want my sounds to do my navigation for me. The third left corridor connects, after about 40 meters, to a junction with the primary maintenance spine, which runs the full length of the academic ring. From there, the route to the Laboratory 7 access hatch is 4 minutes at a walking pace. I did it in just under 3. Through the hatch, down the ladder, into sublevel 9. The amber emergency lighting, the long shadows, the grip strips on the floor running in parallel lines from one end to the other, the smell of recycled air and old equipment, and the deep particular silence of a room that has been empty for a long time. I came off the ladder and moved immediately to the right, behind the loading equipment against the east wall. I set my canvas bag down, opened it, and took out what I needed from inside the wrapped shirt. I did not rush, but I also did not pause. My hands knew what they were doing. I had thought through each step carefully enough that it required no real-time decision-making, just execution. I positioned myself in the space between the loading equipment and the east wall, where the shadow was deepest and the angle from the main cargo door was worst. Worst meaning that someone entering through the cargo door on the north wall would need to be fully into the center of the room before the angle worked for them to see into the east shadow, by which point the distance would be wrong for them and right for me. I knew this because I had measured it. I had stood at the cargo door entry point and looked toward the east wall and noted exactly what was and was not visible from that angle. Then I had stood at the east wall and looked back. Then I had walked the distance between the 2 points and counted my steps and thought about what that distance meant in terms of time. I crouched down and I waited. The waiting was not uncomfortable. I have spent a great deal of my life waiting for things, waiting in deer blinds before dawn, waiting out weather in a barn, waiting for ice to be safe to cross, which requires patience and attention and the ability to be still without becoming inattentive, which is a different skill from simply sitting still. Stillness without attention is just inactivity. Stillness with attention is a tool. I was attentive. I heard the cargo door before it opened. There is a specific mechanical sound that precedes the opening of that door, a sequence of pneumatic releases, and I had heard it twice before, when Sevik and the others had left this space the previous evening. I knew the sound. I counted the beats of it, and at the last beat, the door opened and the ambient noise of the station corridors came briefly into the space before the door closed again behind them. 3 of them. Their footsteps on the alloy floor, heavier than mine, the grip strips muffling some of the sound but not all. They spread out as they entered, the way Sevik had described in the plan I had overheard. Orith to the center, Preen toward the east wall, toward the ladder access. Toward where I was not. I was against the east wall, yes, but behind the loading equipment, in the shadow, at an angle that Preen walked directly past at a distance of about 4 meters without seeing me. His attention was on the ladder, checking the obvious exit, the way the plan required. His attention was where Sevik had told him to put it. That is the thing about a plan that is built around where you expect someone to be. It requires that the person is where you expect them to be. Sevik's plan was built around a version of me that would come down the ladder in the normal way, emerge into the open center of the cargo bay, and then be in a position where the 3 of them surrounded me before I understood the situation. That version of me had not arrived. I had arrived first. I had arrived 15 minutes before them, and I was not in the center of the room, and I was not near the ladder, and I was not anywhere that the plan had accounted for. I let them look. I stayed where I was, still, breathing slow and even, watching them through the narrow gap between the loading equipment and the wall. I watched them move through the space, checking the exit points and the corners and the places where someone might be standing. I watched Preen move to the ladder and look up it. I watched Orith move slowly through the center of the room, turning, looking. I watched Sevik stay near the cargo door with the specific stillness of someone who is confident and does not feel the need to move because he believes the space is already controlled. None of them thought to look closely at the deep shadow behind the loading equipment. That was not a failure of intelligence, it was a failure of information. They did not know that I had been in this space enough times to know every shadow in it, which meant they did not know to look there. They had more information about this space than a random student would have. They had been here before. They had planned around it. But they had less information than I had, and in any situation, the person with the most accurate information is not the person with the loudest voice, or the greatest number of advantages, or the most confident posture. The person with the most accurate information is the person who prepared more carefully. I had prepared more carefully. Sevek said something in his dialect. My chip caught it a beat later. He said, "It has not come yet." Oretha responded. Something like, "We wait." Preen, near the ladder, was very still in the way that a young person is still when they are trying to appear patient, and are not quite succeeding. I looked at the service passage on the west wall, the narrow entrance set back into its shallow alcove, 30 meters of shadow and a slight left curve at the halfway point. I looked at the three of them in the center and north of the room. I looked at the distance between where I was and where I needed to be. I thought about everything I had prepared, everything I had measured and mapped and written in my notebook and thought through slowly and carefully in the amber light over the past weeks. I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth, and then, quietly and with complete certainty, I began. I want to be honest about how I tell this part. There are things I will describe clearly, and there are things I will describe only in their shape and outcome, because the purpose of telling this story is not to celebrate what happened in Sublevel 9 that evening. It is to be truthful about it. And the truth is that what happened was not exciting, the way things are exciting in stories. It was not heroic in the way that word usually gets used. It was fast and it was serious. And when it was over, I sat on the floor and breathed, and felt the full weight of everything that had just been real. I am telling it the way my grandmother told me difficult things should be told, without extra, without drama that is not earned. Just what happened, in the order it happened, and what it meant. I moved from behind the loading equipment along the east wall. I did not move toward them. I moved away from them, which is the opposite of what they would have expected if they had known I was there, and also the opposite of what most people would do in a situation where they feel cornered. The instinct when something is coming toward you is to back away from it. The instinct when you are trying not to be seen is to stay still. I did neither of those things. I moved parallel to the east wall, low and quiet, toward the south end of the cargo bay, which was the part of the room farthest from all three of them, and also the part of the room closest to the west wall, and the service passage entrance. The grip strips on the floor are slightly textured, and I had worn soft-soled shoes specifically because soft soles on textured metal are quieter than hard soles. I had thought about this 2 days ago when I was choosing what to wear for the day. I had thought about it in the same practical way I think about weather, as a condition to be accounted for. Preen was near the ladder on the east wall, facing it, checking it. His back was to me for most of my movement along that wall. Oretha was in the center of the room, turning slowly, looking. Sevek was near the north cargo door, still, confident. The amber light made long shadows from the loading equipment, and I used those shadows. Not by plan, exactly. By attention. I watched where the light was and where it was not, and I moved through the places where it was not. Because I had been in this room enough times in this lighting to know those places the way you know the shape of a room you have slept in for months. I reached the south end of the bay. The west wall was now to my right, about 6 meters away. Oretha turned. I stopped. He was looking toward the south end of the room, in my general direction, but not at me specifically. His 4 eyes work independently, which means his field of vision is very wide, but wide vision is not the same as focused vision. And in dim amber light, at a distance of roughly 12 meters, a person who is still and low and against a dark wall is genuinely difficult to resolve. I know this because I tested it 3 visits ago, by standing against the south wall and looking toward the center of the room from there, and noting how difficult it was to identify specific shapes in that direction. If it was difficult looking from south to center, it would be at least as difficult looking from center to south. I was still. I breathed through my nose, very slowly. Oretha turned back toward the ladder. I moved the 6 meters to the west wall in one continuous, quiet motion. My hand found the edge of the service passage alcove. I stepped into it, into the shadow that was deeper there than anywhere else in the room, and I stopped again. I had the canvas bag on my shoulder. I reached into it without looking, because I had packed it in the specific way that meant I did not need to look, and I took out the portable lighting tool and held it in my left hand, not activated. I took out the utility cord and folded it twice so it was compact and accessible. I put both in my jacket pockets so my hands were free and the bag was empty of everything I needed. and I set the bag down against the wall of the alcove quietly. Then I waited again. This is the part where I need to explain something about the plan, because without understanding it, what happened next does not make full sense. The plan was not to go through the service passage immediately. The service passage was the option of last resort, the guaranteed exit if everything else failed. The plan was something different, and it came from something I had read in the Velthari supplemental papers about the nature of the Velthari hunt itself. The papers described it this way. The hunt is not primarily a physical event, it is a psychological one. Its purpose is to produce a specific experience in the target, the experience of being controlled, of having no choices, of existing entirely within a situation that someone else has designed. The physical component is secondary to that psychological reality. A Velthari hunt that ends with the target fleeing in panic has succeeded, even if the target reaches an exit, because the exit was permitted, and the target knows it was permitted, and that knowledge accomplishes the same reordering of the social hierarchy that direct physical confrontation would. What this means, practically, is that the hunt depends on the target believing they are inside a situation with no real choices. The moment the target understands that they have information and options that the hunters do not know about, the psychological foundation of the hunt collapses. The control is an illusion, and illusions only function as long as the person experiencing them does not see through them. I had seen through it before it began. So the plan was not to flee. The plan was to make them understand, clearly and completely, that I had been in control of this situation from the beginning. Not because I wanted to make a point for its own sake, because I needed them to understand something true about what they were dealing with, and I needed them to understand it in a way they would not forget. I stepped out of the alcove and walked toward the center of the room. I did not move quickly. I did not move slowly. I moved at the same pace I walk every corridor on this station, steady and even, the way a person walks when they know exactly where they are going and have no reason to hurry. Oritha saw me first. His reaction was a full-body stillness, the kind that happens when information arrives that the brain has not prepared a category for. He had been looking for someone who would come down the ladder from above, uncertain and unaware. He was seeing instead someone walking toward him from the south end of the room, from a direction that should have been empty, with a completely level expression, and no apparent awareness that anything about the situation was unusual. The stillness lasted about 2 seconds. Then he made a sound, something short and sharp in the Velthari dialect, that my chip caught as an alert call. Sevek turned from the north wall. Preen turned from the ladder. I stopped walking when I was approximately 7 meters from Orith, which was roughly the center of the cargo bay, which was where I had intended to stop. I set my feet shoulder-width apart, which is a balanced stance, not an aggressive one, just a stable one. I kept my hands visible, at my sides. I looked at all 3 of them in sequence. Sevek first, because Sevek was the center of this situation, and looking at him first acknowledged that clearly. Then Orith, then Preen, then back to Sevek. I said, in the common trade language that all students at the Institute use when addressing a mixed group. You came in through the cargo door. I am glad it was unlocked. I was not certain you had arranged that access, so I used the ladder myself, but I came early, and I have been here for some time. Silence. Sevek's bioluminescence, which had been running a steady confident blue, shifted, just slightly. A small fluctuation, almost imperceptible, toward the frequency that the papers described as associated with recalibration. The moment when new information arrives that requires the existing understanding of a situation to be adjusted. I continued. I kept my voice the same as it always is, which is to say even and unhurried, because that is how I speak when I am being precise. I know what a Velthari hunt is, I said. I read about it 6 weeks ago in the Supplemental Cultural Database. I know what it is intended to accomplish and how it is structured, and what the desired outcome is. I also know that you have been planning this specific one for at least several days, because I heard you discussing it from the ladder access yesterday evening, while you were in here making your arrangements. Preen made a sound. Orith shifted his weight. Sevek did neither of those things. He was very still, and in that stillness I could see him thinking, which is a thing I have observed in people and animals both, the quality of attention that goes inward for a moment to recalculate. I let him recalculate. I waited. Then I said the important part. I am not here because you brought me here. I came here because I chose to come here. I chose this room, and I chose this time, and I chose to be in this room before you arrived, because I wanted you to understand something about the difference between a situation you control and a situation you believe you control. I reached into my right jacket pocket and took out the portable lighting tool. I activated it, not pointing it at anyone, just holding it lit in my hand, which brightened the area around me considerably. and threw the three of them into slightly sharper relief against the amber background. "You made a plan around a space you had visited once," I said. "I have been coming to this space every evening for 3 weeks. I know every exit, every shadow, every surface, and every angle of it. The service passage on the west wall, for example, which you did not mention in your plan, and which I believe you did not notice." I saw Sevik's head turn, very slightly, toward the west wall. "It is 30 meters long," I said. "It curves left at the halfway point. It connects to a maintenance corridor that leads to the secondary residential ring access, which is a 15-minute walk from the station security office." I measured it and walked it twice. Another silence. Longer this time. Preen's bioluminescence was doing something complicated. In a younger Velthari, the supplemental papers said, emotional responses are harder to regulate, and the bioluminescent patterns reflect that. What I was reading from Preen was something close to the pattern associated with the re-evaluation of a situation, combined with something I could not precisely identify but which felt, in my general impression, like the beginning of a different kind of attention. Not predatory. Something quieter. Orathe had straightened up from the slightly forward posture he had taken when he first saw me. He was standing fully upright now, which in the cultural notes I had read was a neutral position, neither aggressive nor submissive, watching. Sevik had not moved at all. He was looking at me with the direct, focused gaze that is different from his usual measuring look. This was the gaze of someone who is genuinely trying to understand something that has not behaved the way they expected. I held his gaze. "I am going to say something here that is true and that I think matters. I did not feel anger in that moment. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy, from the outside, to look at what Sevik had planned and what Sevik had said in the corridor and feel that anger would be a natural response. It might even be expected, and I will not say that somewhere underneath everything I had felt nothing about it. I am human. I feel things. But in that room, in that moment, what I felt was not anger. It was something much simpler and much colder. It was clarity. The specific clarity that comes when a situation has been examined from every angle, and all the decisions have been made, and the only thing left is to be present for what happens next. Sevik said, in the trade language, slowly, "You came here deliberately." I said yes. He said, "You knew what we planned." I said yes. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Why did you not report it?" It was a genuine question. I could tell by the way he asked it, the particular flatness of it, without the edges that a challenging question has. He genuinely wanted to understand. I said, "Because a report would have been a record. A record would have become part of how this situation is understood. I did not want this situation to be understood. I wanted it to be finished." He processed that. I could see him processing it, the slight changes in posture and bioluminescence that accompany genuine thought. I said, "I want to tell you something about Earth. Not the registry classification, not what is in the public database. Something true." I paused, not for effect, but because I was choosing the words carefully, the way I always choose words when the words matter. "Earth is 4.5 billion years old," I said. "In that time, everything that lives on it has been in a continuous, unending process of either finding ways to survive or ceasing to exist. The ones that cease to exist are gone. The ones that are still there developed every tool and skill and instinct that was necessary to still be there. Humans are one of those. We have been developing those tools and skills and instincts for a very long time." I let that sit for a moment. "The registry calls it Class 3, I said. "Moderately competitive. I have thought about that classification a great deal since I arrived here. I think what they mean is that the life forms on Earth are not the largest in the known systems, or the fastest, or the most physically capable. That is true. We are not the largest, we are not the fastest, we are not the most physically capable." I looked at Sevik. "But we are possibly the most prepared," I said. "For most situations. Because preparing for most situations is what our world required of us for a very long time, and we became very good at it." Sevik said nothing. Orathe said nothing. Preen, quietly, said something in the Velthari dialect that my chip caught a beat later. What it translated to was, "It came here first." Not a question. A realization, spoken aloud the way realizations sometimes are, when they arrive and the mind needs to hear them to confirm they are real. I said yes, I came here first. What happened in the next part of that evening I am going to describe carefully, and without additional detail beyond what is necessary to understand it. I have thought about how to write this section more than any other, and I have decided that the most honest way is also the most direct way. The situation in Sublevel 9 did not end with a conversation. I had not come to Sublevel 9 expecting it to end with a conversation. I had come prepared for several possibilities, and I had thought through each of them, and I had brought with me what I needed for each of them. The conversation was one possibility. It was not the only one. When it became clear, in the minutes following what I have described above, that the conversation was not going to be sufficient, I dealt with the situation in the way I had prepared to deal with it if conversation was not sufficient. I dealt with it quickly, because speed is important in those moments, and I dealt with it completely, because incomplete is not a result I was prepared to accept. I used what I had brought with me. I used what I knew about the space. I used what I knew, from the supplemental papers and from the careful reading of 3 hours on a night 3 weeks ago, about the biology of the species I was dealing with. Velthari are larger than humans and have more limbs, but the supplemental papers were detailed, and I had read them carefully, and information, applied correctly, covers a great deal of the gap that size and limb count might otherwise create. It was not long. It was not loud. In a room with thick alloy walls and heavy doors and no active monitoring systems, there was nothing to carry the sound of it beyond the space itself. When it was over, I sat down on the floor of sublevel 9, in the amber emergency light, with the grip strips under me, and the hum of the station in the walls, and I breathed. I breathed for a long time, slow and even, in through the nose and out through the mouth, the way my father taught me, the way I have always breathed when something difficult was done, and the body needed to come back to itself before the mind took over again. My hands were steady. I checked them, because that is something I always do after something difficult, and they were steady. The portable lighting tool was still active, sitting on the floor beside me where I had set it down. The utility cord was where I had used it. My canvas bag was against the west wall where I had left it. I looked at the ceiling of sublevel 9, one strip of amber emergency lighting, running from one end to the other like a line drawn by a careful hand. I thought about Montana. I thought about my grandmother's kitchen and the smell of it in November. I thought about the way cold air feels coming in under a door when a storm is outside. That thin, sharp edge of it at floor level that tells you the weather is real and the walls are doing their job. I thought about how I had always known that the world requires things of you. That existence on Earth is not a given, it is a continuous act of staying. And that staying, done properly, means being ready, always being ready. Even here, in the amber light of a decommissioned cargo bay on a station between two quiet stars, far from everything I had grown up knowing, I was still here. I was staying. I looked at what the evening had required of me, and I accepted it, the way you accept difficult weather, not with happiness, not with regret, but with the clear-eyed recognition that reality does not ask your permission before it arrives. Then I stood up. I picked up my portable lighting tool. I picked up my canvas bag. And I began to think about what came next. Because what came next was the part that most people do not account for, and I had been accounting for it since the beginning. There was work to do. My father used to say that the hardest part of any difficult task is not the task itself. The hardest part is what comes after, the clearing up, the putting things back in order. The careful, unglamorous work of making sure that what happened leaves behind only what you intended to leave behind, and nothing else. He was talking about things like fallen trees after a storm, or flooded ground after a thaw, or the long process of repairing a fence line that a winter had pulled apart over several months. But the principle, I had always found, applied to most things. The principle applied here. I stood in the amber light of sublevel 9 and I thought about the problem the way I think about all problems, not emotionally, not with the part of the mind that reacts, with the part that organizes, the part that looks at a situation and identifies what needs to happen, in what order, and what resources are available to make it happen. The situation was this. Sublevel 9 was a decommissioned cargo bay in the lower levels of Velinoth Station. It had no active monitoring systems, which I had confirmed on my second visit by checking the walls and ceiling for the small indicator lights that active sensor arrays always carry, and finding none. The cargo door on the north wall had been accessed through an arrangement that Sevik had made with a member of the maintenance crew, which meant there was at least one person on the station who knew that Sevik had arranged access to this space. The latter access on the east wall was an unmapped entry point that appeared in no official student records, because students were not supposed to be in the lower levels at all, and the route I used was through a hatch that most people did not notice and could not open easily. The station's biological hazard sensors were the first practical concern. I had read about them in the engineering manual during my second week, the same reading session where I had first noted the waste reclamation infrastructure. The biological hazard sensors on Velinoth Station operate on a passive detection system, meaning they respond to specific chemical signatures rather than actively scanning. They are calibrated primarily for the most common biological materials on the station, those associated with the 31 species in regular residence, and they are most sensitive in the residential and academic rings where biological activity is highest. In the lower maintenance levels, the sensors are present but set to a much lower sensitivity threshold, because the lower levels regularly contain biological residue from the waste reclamation process itself, and if the sensors in those areas were set to high sensitivity, they would be continuously triggering on their own infrastructure. This is the kind of detail that is in the engineering manual and that most people never read, because most people have no reason to think about the sensitivity calibration of biological hazard sensors in decommissioned cargo bays. I had a reason. I had read it. The practical meaning of low sensitivity sensors in the lower levels was that the threshold for triggering an alert was significantly higher than it would be in the academic ring. This gave me time. Not unlimited time, but enough time to work methodically, which is the only way I know how to work. I started with the most immediate element, which was the space itself. Sublevel 9 has its own connection to the station's waste reclamation system, a legacy of its time as an active cargo bay, where biological waste from long-haul transport crews would have been processed. The access point is a large reclamation port on the south wall, behind a panel that requires a specific tool to open. The maintenance kit I had taken from the supply room 2 nights ago contained that tool. I had checked, specifically, before I took it. I opened the panel. The reclamation system is a closed-loop ionic processing system, which means it breaks biological material down at the ionic level into base compounds that are then filtered and recycled through the station's resource management infrastructure. It operates at high temperature and high ionic concentration. The engineering manual had described the process in precise technical terms. What it meant practically was that organic material introduced into the system at a reclamation port would be processed completely, leaving no identifiable residue, within a standard processing cycle of approximately 90 minutes. I worked steadily and without rushing. Rushing produces mistakes, and mistakes leave traces, and traces are exactly what I was working to prevent. I was thorough in the way that I am thorough about everything that matters, which is completely. The ionic temperature of the reclamation system is relevant to one specific additional fact that I had noted from the xenobiology supplemental papers. Velthari bioluminescence, which is produced by a specific protein structure in the outer carapace, denatures completely at temperatures above a certain ionic threshold. The reclamation system operates well above that threshold. This meant that the distinctive quality that makes Velthari tissue visually identifiable would not survive the processing cycle. What came out of the other end would be base compounds indistinguishable from the general biological residue that the system processes routinely. I am being precise about this, because precision is important, and because I made a decision, in sublevel 9, to be honest about how I thought, and what I knew, and how I used that knowledge. Being honest includes being precise, even when the precise details are not comfortable to describe. The reclamation port process took time. I used the time to address the second element of the problem, which was the space itself. The alloy floor of the cargo bay is textured with grip strips, which are a practical surface for cargo handling but which are also, I had noticed during my many evenings here, a surface that holds very little in the way of residue. The texture moves things toward the drainage channels that run along each wall, which connect to the lower infrastructure of the station. I used water from my personal supply bottle and the utility cord in a cleaning application, working methodically from the center of the room outward toward the walls, following the natural direction of the drainage channels. I had brought more water than I appeared to have. My personal supply bottle is a large one, military specification, that my father bought me before I left Earth because he said that the first thing you account for in any new environment is hydration. It holds 2 liters. I had filled it completely before advanced systems that afternoon. 2 liters, applied methodically, is sufficient for a space the size of sublevel 9, when you are working with the natural drainage direction of the floor rather than against it. By the time the floor was addressed, the reclamation system had been running for 40 minutes. I still had approximately 50 minutes of processing time remaining. I turned to the third element, which was the most complicated one: the communication devices. Every student at the Institute carries a personal communication device, a small unit that connects to the station network and handles messaging, scheduling, academic records, and location logging. Location logging is an important detail. The devices log their position continuously, creating a record of where each device has been and when. This record is stored on the station network and is technically accessible to station security in the event of an investigation. I had taken the 3 devices during the process of dealing with the situation, specifically because I had known about the location logging and planned for it. The devices were in my left jacket pocket, which is why that pocket had been empty when I packed the other items, because I had anticipated needing the space. The location logs were the most technically demanding part of the problem. I am not a network specialist, But I had spent time in the 2 days between hearing the plan and arriving in Sublevel 9 reading everything I could find in the Institute's open academic database about station network architecture, device communication protocols, and data storage systems. I had read it with the same focused attention I give to xenobiology, and I had understood most of it, because systems have logic, and logic is something I follow well. What I understood was this. The device location logs are stored in 2 places, on the device itself and on the station network server. The device record is continuous and real-time. The network record is synchronized on a scheduled basis, every 6 hours, with the most recent synchronization occurring at midday and the next scheduled for the late evening. It was currently early evening. I was between synchronization cycles. The device record could be addressed directly. Each device has a maintenance access mode, not advertised in the standard user interface but present in the technical documentation that I had found in an academic paper about station device architecture written by a graduate student at a research institution 3 systems away, which had been published 4 years ago, and which had apparently been read by very few people, because its access count in the database was 11. I was number 12. Maintenance access mode requires a specific input sequence. The paper described it in a footnote, as an aside in a technical explanation of something else. I had written the sequence in my notebook. I entered the sequence on each device in turn. In maintenance access mode, the local log storage is accessible and editable. I removed the location records for the relevant period from each device, which took several minutes per device because I was careful to do it correctly, checking the result after each deletion to confirm it had processed properly. The network record was a different matter. The network record would show the device's last known locations as of the midday synchronization, which was the academic ring, where all 3 of them had been during the middle of the day. After midday, the network had no synchronized record, because synchronization had not yet occurred. When synchronization did occur, later that evening, it would attempt to update from the devices. If the devices were offline, which they would be if they were not transmitting, the synchronization would log a failed update and note the devices as unreachable. Unreachable devices in a known signal dead zone are logged differently from devices that simply stop transmitting in an active coverage area. The lower maintenance levels of Velinoth Station are a known signal dead zone, documented in the network architecture because of the ionic interference from the reclamation infrastructure. A device that goes offline in a signal dead zone generates a different log entry than a device that goes offline in a covered area. The dead zone entry is a routine technical note. It does not trigger review. I needed the devices to be logged as offline in the dead zone rather than offline in an active coverage area. This meant they needed to be powered down here, in sublevel 9, rather than at any point after leaving the lower levels. I powered each device down in sequence, after completing the local log deletion, and placed them in the deep interior pocket of my canvas bag, wrapped in the spare shirt, where the material would additionally suppress any residual signal during transport. The reclamation system completed its cycle at the 80-minute mark. I closed the access panel and returned the tool to the maintenance kit. I spent the next 15 minutes completing a final check of the space. I walked it in a methodical grid pattern, using the portable lighting tool at full brightness, checking the floor, the walls, the loading equipment surfaces, the ladder rungs, everywhere I or anyone else had been. I was looking for anything that should not be there, anything that was out of place compared to the way the space had looked during all my previous evenings here. I found 3 things that needed attention. A small impression in the dust along the base of the north wall, where the cargo door had been pushed open more forcefully than usual. A mark on the surface of the loading equipment where I had steadied myself. A scuff on the 4th rung of the ladder that had not been there before. I addressed each one. The dust impression was easy. The mark on the loading equipment took slightly longer, because the surface was a composite material that needed a different approach than metal. The ladder scuff I addressed with the edge of the utility cord, which has a texture that works against composite surfaces effectively when used at the right angle. I had not planned for the ladder scuff specifically, but I had brought the utility cord because I had thought about the general category of marks on surfaces, and having the right tool for a general category covers most of the specific cases within it. When the check was complete and everything was addressed, I stood in the center of sublevel 9 and turned slowly, looking at the full space one more time. The amber emergency lighting ran its single strip across the ceiling. The grip strips on the floor showed their parallel lines from wall to wall, undisturbed. The loading equipment sat against the east wall where it had always been. The reclamation panel on the south wall was closed. The cargo door on the north wall was as it had been. The service passage on the west wall was a narrow shadow in its shallow alcove. The space looked the way it had always looked. Quiet, empty, unused. I picked up my canvas bag. I put the portable lighting tool, the maintenance kit, and the folded utility cord back into it, wrapped in the spare shirt, in the specific arrangement that I use to pack things so they do not shift during movement. I checked that the 3 devices were secure in the interior pocket. I walked to the east wall. I climbed the ladder. I moved through the maintenance corridor. I came up through the access hatch behind Laboratory 7 and stood in the dim corridor of the academic ring. The station around me was running its normal evening operation. Distant sounds of students in the commons, the hum of the life systems in the ceiling, the particular ambient quality of a large structure going about its ordinary business, unaware that anything had happened in its lower levels. I walked to the supply room in the residential ring. I returned the portable lighting tool and the maintenance kit to their places on the shelves, in the positions where I had found them. Supply room items are not individually logged unless they are high-value equipment, and the items I had used were not high value. They were ordinary, the kind of things that are borrowed and returned constantly without record. The utility cord I kept, because utility cord is a consumable item, and the length I had used was sufficiently reduced that returning it would have required explaining why it was shorter than it had been. I disposed of it through the residential ring's standard waste system, which connects to the same reclamation infrastructure as the lower levels and processes everything the same way. Then I went to the station's internal network terminal in the dormitory common area, the public access terminal that any student can use, and I looked up the maintenance worker that Sevek had arranged the cargo door access through. This took some careful thought. I did not know who the worker was specifically. What I knew was that someone on the maintenance crew had provided access to a decommissioned cargo bay to a student, which is not a permitted action, and which that person would not want on their record. I also knew that this person was aware that 3 students had planned to use that space for something, because the arrangement of access implies knowledge of intent even if not specific knowledge of what the intent was. This person was a variable I could not leave unaddressed. I found the maintenance crew roster on the station's public operations database, which lists all crew members by division and ring assignment. I identified the crew members responsible for the lower-level maintenance of the 4th academic ring, which is the ring sub-level 9 falls under administratively. There were 4 crew members listed. I thought about what I knew. The cargo door arrangement had been made by Sevek, who was a Velthari student. The maintenance crew of the 4th academic ring lower levels had 1 Velthari member. His name on the roster was listed in the Velthari naming format, and his ring assignment had him responsible for sub-levels 7 through 11. That was sufficient. I did not visit him that evening. I went to my dormitory room, showered, changed my clothes, and placed everything I had been wearing in the standard laundry system. I ate a small meal that I prepared from the supplies I keep in my room for evenings when I do not want to go to the commons. I sat at my desk and I thought about the maintenance worker and what needed to happen with that situation, and I thought about it carefully, from several angles, until I had a clear picture of what the right approach was. The right approach was direct, not threatening, not complicated, simply direct. The following morning, before breakfast, I found him in the maintenance corridor adjacent to sub-level 8, where the roster indicated he would be during his early shift. He was a compact, older Velthari, with bioluminescence that ran in the lower intensity pattern of middle age, and he was carrying a diagnostic scanner and checking a ventilation access point on the east wall. He heard me coming and turned. When he saw me, his bioluminescence did something complicated, several frequencies at once, in a pattern that the supplemental papers associated with a rapid assessment of a situation, combined with a strong preference for not being in it. I stopped about 2 meters from him. I kept my hands visible. I kept my voice the same as it always is. I said, "I know you arranged the cargo door access for Sevek. I know that you knew he intended to use the space for something involving me. I am not going to make a report about what I know." He was very still. I said, "I am also not going to ask you to do anything. I am going to tell you one thing, and then I am going to leave, and we are not going to speak about any of this again." He waited. I said, "Sevek and the others will not be coming back to sub-level 9. They will not be coming back anywhere. The space is clean and the devices are logged as lost in a dead zone, and there is nothing in the record that connects the event to any person on this station. That will remain true as long as the number of people who know anything about this arrangement stays exactly where it currently is." I let that land. Then I said, "I think the Outer Ring 7 Maintenance Division has open contract positions. I think it is a pleasant assignment. I think a transfer request submitted in the next few days would be processed without particular attention, because transfers between maintenance divisions are routine and common." I looked at him steadily. "I hope your shift is going well," I said. "The ventilation access point on the east wall of this corridor has had a recurring alignment issue for about 3 weeks. It makes a particular sound in the early mornings. You might find the calibration is slightly off on the secondary intake. He looked at me for a long moment, then he looked at the ventilation access point. Then he looked back at me. I nodded once, picked up my canvas bag, and walked away down the corridor toward the ladder access that would take me back up to the academic ring and breakfast and advanced xenobiology and the ordinary, uncomplicated, quietly wonderful business of being a student with work to do and time to do it in. Behind me, I heard him begin adjusting the secondary intake calibration. By the end of the week, the crew roster for Outer Ring 7 showed a new addition. I noted it without satisfaction and without anything else in particular. It was simply a thing that had needed to happen, and it had happened, and the situation was now as closed as a situation of this kind can be closed. I went to breakfast. I sat in my usual spot. I opened my notebook and reviewed my materials for the day. The station hummed around me. The stars outside the viewport were steady and far and completely indifferent. I had work to do. I always have work to do. 3 days after the evening in Sublevel 9, the Institute made an announcement. It came through the standard student information channel, which pushes notifications to all registered devices at the beginning of the morning period. Most announcements through that channel are administrative. Schedule changes, maintenance windows that would affect certain dormitory systems, reminders about academic deadlines, the kind of information that students read quickly and then forget within the hour because it requires nothing of them. This one was different, not in tone. The tone was exactly the same as all the others, flat and informational. The kind of language that institutions use when they want to convey something without conveying anything beyond the surface of what they are saying, but the content was different. The announcement stated that 3 students, named individually in the Velthari naming format that the trade language transliteration renders as Sevuk, Orithe, and Preen, had been recorded as absent from their registered accommodation and academic sessions without prior notification to the Institute. As per standard Institute protocol for unaccounted student absences of more than 48 hours, the matter had been referred to the station's administrative office for a welfare review. Students with relevant information were encouraged to contact the student well-being coordinator. I read it twice, once for the content, and once to confirm that the content was exactly what it appeared to be and nothing more. It was exactly what it appeared to be. A standard welfare review notification. The language used for a student who had stopped attending class and whose room showed no signs of recent occupation. The kind of language that carries no suspicion in it, because at this stage there is nothing to be suspicious about. Students leave stations. Students transfer without adequate notice. Students, particularly students from species with strong clan structures and complex family obligations, sometimes depart abruptly in response to circumstances at home that take priority over academic schedules. The administrative office was doing what administrative offices do. They were following protocol. They were generating the correct documentation for an absence that had crossed the notification threshold. They were, in the careful and procedural language of institutional bureaucracy, covering their responsibilities. I set my device down beside my breakfast tray and looked out the viewport at the stars. I noted, from a place of careful and honest self-observation, that I felt nothing dramatic in that moment, no relief that was large enough to name. No anxiety, no particular emotion that arrived with enough weight to require attention. What I felt was closer to what I feel at the end of any task I have completed thoroughly. A quiet and functional settling, the way a structure settles when all its components are correctly placed and bearing the load they were designed for. I finished my breakfast. I returned my tray. I went to applied systems theory. The welfare review, as I understood station procedures, would generate a standard investigative process that would run through the administrative office and, if the review produced no clear resolution within a defined period, be referred to station security for a secondary assessment. I had thought about this timeline before the evening in Sublevel 9, with the same care I had thought about everything else. The standard administrative welfare review period on a station of this size and category is 7 days. The secondary security assessment, if triggered, is an additional process that begins from the end of the welfare review and typically involves interviews with students who are known associates of the absent individuals, a review of their device records, and a physical check of spaces associated with their recent activity. I had addressed the device records. I had addressed the physical spaces. I had addressed the one person who had specific knowledge of an arrangement that connected the absent students to a space. The secondary security assessment, if it occurred, would find nothing. Not because I was confident in an arrogant way, because I had been methodical, and methodical work, when done completely and correctly, does not leave the kind of traces that a standard secondary assessment is designed to find. There is a difference between being lucky and being prepared. Luck is when circumstances happen to fall in your favor without your involvement. Preparation is when you have thought through the circumstances carefully enough that favorable outcomes are the result of decisions you made, rather than things that simply happened. I had not been lucky. I had been prepared. I attended all my classes that week. I completed all my assignments. I scored well on a short assessment in advanced systems theory that covered the material from the previous 2 weeks. I added 4 more papers to my supplemental reading list and worked through 2 of them during the evenings. I went to sub-level 9 twice, because it was still the best quiet space on the station and because avoiding it would have been a change in my routine. And changes in routine are the kind of things that get noticed by people who are paying attention to routines. I sat against the far wall in the amber light with my notebook on my knee, the same as always. The space was exactly as I had left it, quiet and dim and empty, in the particular way that a space is empty when it has always been empty to everyone except you. On the 6th day after the announcement, I was called to the Student Well-Being Coordinator's office. The Student Well-Being Coordinator at the Institute is a Sifani, named something my chip renders as close to Coordinator Sef. She is small even by Sifani standards, and she communicates through a combination of the trade language and skin color shifts that the chip handles reasonably well, though there is always a slight lag on the color shift component that means her emotional tone arrives about a half second after her words. She is, as far as I can assess, a genuinely kind individual who takes her role seriously and is good at it. She asked me to sit down. I sat. She said that she was conducting standard outreach as part of the welfare review process, speaking with students who had regular contact with Sevak, Orithe, and Preen. She said that my name had appeared in the same academic sections as all 3 students, and that she wanted to ask a few questions about my observations of them in the period before their absence was noted. I said I was happy to help in whatever way I could. She asked when I had last seen them. I said the last time I had seen all 3 of them together was in the corridor outside Advanced Systems, some days prior to the announcement, when I had passed them in the usual course of moving between classes. She wrote this down on her recording device. She asked whether I had noticed anything unusual about their behavior or demeanor. I thought about this for what felt like a genuine and appropriate amount of time, and then I said that I had not noticed anything that struck me as unusual, though I acknowledged that my interactions with them had been limited to the shared academic environment and I did not know them personally. She wrote this down as well. She asked whether they had ever spoken to me directly or indicated anything about their plans or circumstances. I said that Sevak had made a comment to me in the corridor on one occasion, something brief and not particularly meaningful, and that beyond that I had not had any specific conversations with them. She asked what the comment had been. I said it had been something about Earth and the registry classification, the kind of remark that sometimes comes up when another student is curious about the only human at the Institute, and that I had responded briefly and moved on. She nodded. Her skin shifted a color that the chip described as warm acknowledgement. She said that the review was showing no information that would indicate anything other than a voluntary departure, possibly connected to family circumstances, and that this was not an uncommon outcome for Velthari students who came from socially prominent family clusters where obligations could arise without warning. I said that made sense to me. She asked, with what seemed like genuine personal interest rather than official inquiry, how I was finding the Institute overall, whether I was settling in well, whether there was anything about my experience that she should know about or that I would find helpful to discuss. I told her that I was finding the Institute genuinely excellent, that the academic program was strong and the faculty were engaged, that I had found my footing reasonably well and felt comfortable in the environment. I said this without performance, because it was true. The Institute was excellent. The academic program was strong. I had found my footing, in every sense of the word. She seemed pleased by this. Her skin shifted through 2 warm colors in sequence. She said that the Institute was glad to have me, and that if I ever wanted to talk, her door was open. I thanked her. I left. In the corridor outside her office, I stood for a moment. The station around me was doing what it always does, running its ordinary business, students moving between classes, the hum of systems in the walls, the translated layering of 31 species worth of daily life pressing gently against each other in the way it does on a station where every species has learned to share the same corridors. I felt something in that moment that I had not expected and that I want to be accurate about, because accuracy matters to me and this is part of the truth of what the experience was. It was not quite relief. It was not quite satisfaction. It was closer to something like weight, the weight of knowing that a thing had happened that could not unhappen, and that the world had continued anyway, and that I had continued with it, and that continuing was both the right outcome and a harder thing to carry than I had fully anticipated. I had known it would be hard to carry. I had understood that from the beginning, from the moment I sat on the floor of sub-level 9 and breathed and checked my hands and thought about my grandmother's kitchen, I had not expected it to be easy. I had not expected to feel nothing. What I had expected, and what I felt, was that the weight was manageable. Manageable in the specific sense that means it does not prevent you from functioning. It does not stop you from going to your classes and doing your work and sitting at your usual spot at breakfast and reviewing your notes. It is simply present, the way some weights are present, not as a crisis but as a permanent addition to what you carry. Like a stone put in a pack that you adjust to and eventually stop noticing with every step, though you always know it is there. I adjusted to it. I went to advanced xenobiology, which was excellent that day, because Instructor Have introduced a new paper on Dren nervous system architecture that connected to 3 things I had independently researched, and the pleasure of connection is always real and always helpful, whatever else is also present. The secondary security assessment began on the 8th day. I knew it had begun because I was called to a different office, not the warm and comfortable space of Coordinator Seth, with its soft lighting and the slight color shift communication that arrived half a second behind the words. A larger, more functional space in the administrative section of the 3rd academic ring, with standard station lighting and a desk with a recording device and 2 chairs, one on each side of the desk. The security officer was a Dren. Her name, as the Institute roster listed it, was Officer Harriet Van, and she had 4 eyes that moved independently of each other, and a wide and solid physical presence that communicated, without any apparent effort on her part, that she was someone who had been in many rooms with many different people, and had very rarely been surprised by what she found in them. She asked me to sit. I sat. She said that she was conducting a secondary assessment as part of the welfare review for 3 absent students, and that the assessment involved speaking with students from shared academic sections. Standard process, she said. She said it the way people say things that are true, and also useful for establishing a tone of ordinary procedure. I said I understood. She asked me questions. Most of them were the same questions Coordinator Seth had asked, covered again from a slightly different angle, which is standard practice in investigative interviews and which I had expected. When did I last see them? What was the nature of our interactions? Had I noticed anything unusual? I gave the same answers I had given before, because they were the same true answers, and true answers do not need to be adjusted between tellings. She listened to each answer with the particular quality of attention that 4 independently moving eyes make possible, which is a very full and thorough quality of attention. She wrote some things on her recording device. She did not react visibly to any of my answers in a way that indicated either satisfaction or dissatisfaction. Then she asked me something that Coordinator Seth had not asked. She said, "The device records for all 3 students show the last synchronized location as the academic ring, at midday on the day they were last seen in class. After midday, the devices went offline. The network logged them as unreachable in a dead zone area. Do you know anything about the lower maintenance levels of the 4th academic ring?" I thought about this question for what was again a genuine and appropriate amount of time. I said, "I know they exist. I do not spend time in the maintenance levels." This was true. I had not said I had never been there. I had not said I did not know them. I said I did not spend time there, which is accurate, because spending time implies a regular or deliberate presence, and my presence in sublevel 9 was not something I was going to characterize with a word that implied routine. She looked at me, all 4 eyes, moving with slight independence, covering more of my face and posture than 2 eyes can cover from a single angle. Dren sensory processing is, the xenobiology papers had told me, exceptionally good at identifying inconsistencies between what a subject says and how their body responds to saying it. I was not inconsistent, because I was not lying. I was selecting true things from the available true things, which is a different operation, and one that the body, if you are genuinely calm and genuinely certain of what you are saying, does not mark the same way it marks a lie. I was calm. I was certain. The weight I described, that stone in the pack, was present, as it always was, but it was managed, as it always was. My hands were still. My breathing was even. My posture was the same posture I bring to every chair in every room. She said, "The lower maintenance levels have a signal dead zone due to ionic interference from the reclamation infrastructure. Devices going offline in that zone is a logged routine event." I said, "That sounds like a reasonable engineering outcome." She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she made a note on her recording device. She said, "One of the maintenance crew members from the lower level division recently transferred to Outer Ring 7. I said, "I did not know that." This was also true. I had not known it at the moment she said it, in the sense that I had not received a direct confirmation of the transfer. I had seen the roster edition and drawn a conclusion, but a conclusion is not knowledge in the same category as a confirmed fact. She nodded. She She made another note. Then she said something that was not a question, and not quite a statement. It existed in the space between the two, in the way that experienced investigators sometimes speak, putting something in the air to see what comes back. She said, "I have been on this station for 11 years. I have processed a great many welfare reviews. Velthari students from prominent family clusters do sometimes depart without notice. It is within the statistical range of expected outcomes." I said, "That sounds like it must make your work complicated sometimes, having to account for a wide range of normal outcomes." She looked at me, a long look, the four-eyed kind that misses very little. Then she said, "It does." She closed her recording device. She stood up. I stood up. She said, "Thank you for your time. If you think of anything relevant, please contact the administrative office." I said I would. I thanked her for her work. I left. In the corridor, I walked at my normal pace toward the academic wing. My heart rate was slightly elevated, which was appropriate and expected and not a problem. By the time I reached the junction with the main corridor, it had returned to normal, because there was nothing to sustain the elevation now that the room and the four-eyed attention were behind me. I thought about Officer Horate Van. I thought about her 11 years on this station and the quality of her attention, and the particular way she had placed that last observation in the air between us and waited. She was good at her work. I had understood that from the first minute in her office, the same way I understand the quality of anything I pay attention to carefully. She had found nothing, because there was nothing to find, not because she had not looked. She had looked well, but looking well at a clean surface finds nothing, regardless of how capable the looking is. I thought about what she had and had not said. I thought about the note she had made on her recording device after my answer about the maintenance levels. I thought about the word that Preen had said, quietly, in sublevel 9, that simple, flat, realizing word. It came here first. I thought about how that word, and what it meant, was now somewhere inside Officer Horate Van's understanding of this situation, even if she could not put a clear shape to it. Not as evidence, not as anything she could act on, just as a quality in the air of the interview, a texture to the answers she had received, a something that her 11 years of attention had registered even if it could not be formally recorded. And she knew something had happened. She simply had no way to prove what it was, or that it had happened at all. That was the outcome I had worked toward. Not invisibility, because complete invisibility is not achievable, and the attempt to achieve it produces the kind of over-engineering that creates its own traces. What I had worked toward was deniability grounded in genuine absence of evidence, which is different and more durable. I went to lunch. I sat at my usual spot. I opened my notebook. The commons was full and warm and loud in the way it always is. Students moving and talking and the translated layering of 31 species doing the ordinary work of a midday meal. The stars outside the viewport were steady and indifferent and very far away. Something was different from the weeks before, though. I noticed it during my second day back in the normal routine, and confirmed it over the following days by observation. It was a quality in the way I was perceived in the commons and in the corridors. Not fear. Not exactly. The Velthari social cluster that had occupied the central table every morning was quieter than it had been. The students who had previously moved around me in corridors now moved with a slightly wider margin, not rushed, not obvious, just a small and consistent additional distance. The measuring looks that I had become accustomed to, the curious assessments that followed the only human at the institute from room to room, had changed in quality. They were still present, but they were different now. Word travels in ways that leave no evidence. I knew that. I had known it from the outline of my thinking before any of this began. You do not need to announce something for it to be known. Information moves through a community the way pressure moves through water, indirectly, through the displacement it causes in everything around it. Nobody on the station could prove anything had happened, but something had changed in the texture of the air around me, and the people who lived in that air could feel it, even without knowing its source. I sat in the commons and ate my lunch and reviewed my notes, the same as always. The additional distance in the corridors, the wider margin, the quieter quality of the looks directed at me from the central table, none of it was large, none of it was dramatic, but it was consistent, and consistency is how you know something is real rather than coincidental. I noted it without satisfaction and without anything else in particular. It was simply information, another thing to be accurate about. I had come to this station to learn. I was learning. The academic program was strong, the faculty were engaged, and I had, as I told Coordinator Seth, found my footing in the environment. In every sense of the word. I finished my lunch. I closed my notebook. I returned my tray. I went back to work. Time moves differently when you stop waiting for something. I had not realized how much of my attention, over those weeks of watching Sevuk and Orithe and Preen circle closer, had been allocated to the waiting itself. Not fear, as I have said before. Not anxiety in the way that word usually means, but a background level of alertness, a portion of my processing that was always running a quiet check on the environment around me, measuring distances and reading postures and noting the small details that add up to the larger picture of what a situation is becoming. When that stopped being necessary, I noticed the absence of it the way you notice the absence of a sound you have become so used to that you stopped hearing it. The silence where the hum used to be, the space in my attention where the monitoring had been. I filled it with work. I always fill available space with work. It is not a discipline I have to impose on myself. It is simply what I do, because work is interesting and the world is full of things worth understanding, and the time available to understand them is always shorter than I would like. The weeks after Officer Horad Van's secondary assessment were some of the best academic weeks I had at the Institute. I moved through the xenobiology curriculum at a pace that Instructor Hove acknowledged, in her particular way of acknowledging things, which is to say she stopped pausing at my desk for 1 second and started pausing for 2. I completed a significant paper on Sci-Fi adaptive immunology that she entered into the Institute's student research archive, which meant it became part of the permanent academic record of the school and could be accessed by students in future years. I found that thought genuinely pleasing. Something I had made, sitting at my desk in my dormitory room with my paper notebook and my careful handwriting and my habit of reading supplemental papers at 3 in the morning, would exist in that archive long after I had left. I also began spending more time in the student commons. This was a deliberate choice, and I want to explain it clearly because it was not about any social performance. It was not about being seen, or about sending a message to anyone, or about demonstrating anything to the students who now maintained a slightly wider margin around me in the corridors. It was about something simpler than any of that. I had come to Velinoth Station to learn. Learning includes the academic program and the research and the papers and the grades. But learning at an institution that contains 31 species includes something else as well. Something that cannot be found in a supplemental database or a textbook or the quiet of Sublevel 9. It includes the slow, complicated, genuinely interesting work of learning how different kinds of minds understand the world. What questions they ask and which ones they do not think to ask. What they find obvious that I find surprising, and what I find obvious that surprises them. I had been sitting at the end of the East Table, alone, for most of my time at the Institute. That was the right choice for the period when I needed to be alert and contained and careful. It was not the right choice for the period that followed. I started sitting in the middle of the East Table. Small difference in position, significant difference in what happened around me. The Sci-Fi student I have mentioned before, the one whose name the chip renders as Res, was the first person to sit near me voluntarily, which was not surprising because Res had been showing the kind of low-level curiosity about me for several weeks that Sci-Fi expressed through proximity rather than direct approach. They move closer to things they are interested in. They do not necessarily speak. They simply reduce the distance and wait to see what happens. I reduced the distance on my side by sitting in the middle of the table instead of the end. Res sat 3 seats away the first day, 2 the second. On the third day, Res sat directly across from me and looked at my paper notebook for a long moment, and then looked at me and said, in the trade language, something that the chip rendered as. Res said, "Why?" I thought about how to answer this in a way that was true and also communicable across the particular gap between a human who grew up in Montana and a Sci-Fi who grew up wherever Res grew up, which I did not yet know but intended to find out. I said, because when I write something by hand, I have to slow down enough to think about each word before I write it. The physical act of forming each letter gives my mind time to decide whether the word is actually the right one. When I type, the words come out faster than I can fully evaluate them. Res was quiet for a moment. Their skin shifted through 2 colors, which the chip rendered as thoughtful consideration followed by agreement. Then Res said, "We have a similar practice. When a Sci-Fi wants to understand something important, we express it in our oldest color language rather than the spoken trade language. The oldest color language has fewer words. It forces precision." I said, "I would like to learn about that." And that was the beginning of the first genuine friendship I made at the Institute, which grew over the following weeks into something that I value in the particular way you value things, that arrive unexpectedly, and turn out to be exactly what you needed, without knowing you needed them. Res is methodical and curious and has a sense of humor that operates on a delay, the joke arriving fully formed several seconds after the situation that prompted it, like a translation that takes slightly longer than average but is always more precise when it lands. We studied together 3 evenings a week. I learned approximately 40 expressions in the Sci-Fi oldest color language, which I cannot physically produce because I do not have bioluminescent skin, but which I can recognize and read, which Ress said was unusual for a non-Sci-Fi student, and which I found deeply interesting as a system of communication that encodes emotional and intellectual nuance in wavelength rather than syntax. Other students began sitting near me as well, over the weeks that followed. Not all at once, not in a rush, but gradually, in the way that things happen gradually when they are happening for real rather than for appearance. A Dren student from my advanced systems class who had been observing my practical work and one day asked, directly and without preamble, how I approached the spatial reasoning component, which he found difficult. Two Sci-Fi from Ress's social circle who came along one evening and stayed. A student from a species I had not encountered before whose name the chip rendered approximately as Tev, who was studying a completely different academic program but had ended up in the library at the same time as me 3 weeks in a row and eventually simply sat down at my table and opened their own materials, which I had understood as a statement of comfortable coexistence rather than an attempt at conversation, and which I had honored by continuing my own work without comment. The commons felt different from the inside than it had from the end of the east table. Louder, yes. More demanding, yes. But also more real, in the way that things are more real when you are inside them rather than observing them from the edge. I still went to sub-level 9. Less often, because the evenings were fuller now, but still regularly. I still needed the particular silence of it, the amber light, the hum of the station in the walls. Some things about yourself you do not change because circumstances have shifted. Some things are just what you are. I sat against the far wall with my notebook on my knee, and I thought about things in the long, uninterrupted way that the space allowed. I thought about my research paper and where it might go next. I thought about the Sci-Fi oldest color language and the parallel it drew with my own paper and handwriting system, the use of constraint to force precision. I thought about the ventilation alignment issue that I had mentioned to the maintenance worker, which had in fact been a genuine issue, and which appeared to have been corrected, because the particular sound it had been making in the early mornings was no longer present. I thought about home sometimes, about Montana and my brother Eli and my grandmother's kitchen, about what I would tell them when I went back, and what I would leave out, and how the gap between those two things had grown since I arrived here in a way that was not comfortable to think about, but that I thought about anyway, because not thinking about uncomfortable things is not a discipline I practice. What I would tell them: I am doing well. The school is excellent. I made a friend who communicates in color wavelengths and arrives at jokes 4 seconds after everyone else, and is the most precise thinker I have encountered at the Institute. I am learning things that could not be learned anywhere on Earth. What I would leave out: everything from parts 3 through 6 of this account. Not because I am ashamed of it. The thing I feel about it is more complicated than shame, and more complicated than the absence of shame. It is something closer to what I said earlier, the weight that is present but managed, the stone in the pack that you adjust to and carry forward, because it is part of what the journey required, and the journey is not finished. What I would leave out because my grandmother taught me, without ever saying it directly but through 1,000 examples of her own conduct, that some things are carried privately, and that carrying them privately is not weakness or dishonesty. It is the responsible management of information that would burden other people without giving them any ability to do anything about it. My grandmother is a practical woman. I have said this several times. It remains true. 3 months after the security assessment ended and the welfare review was formally closed, Officer Harriet Van spoke to me again. It was in the corridor near the Laboratory 7 junction, which I noticed with a quiet private awareness, since the access hatch behind Lab 7 is the route I still use when I go to Sub-Level 9. She was walking in the same direction I was walking, which may or may not have been coincidence. In 11 years on a station this size, a person learns its corridors well enough that walking in someone's direction can be either accidental or deliberate, and appear identical in either case. She fell into step beside me without making it into anything. No official stop, no request to speak. Simply a shared direction and a pace that matched mine. She said, "The welfare review for the 3 absent students was formally closed last week. Classified as voluntary departure, family circumstances." I said, "I saw the notification." She said, "The classification is standard for cases where no evidence of an alternative explanation is identified." I said, "That sounds like a thorough process." She was quiet for a few steps. The corridor hummed around us. Students moved past in both directions, paying us no particular attention. Then she said, "I pulled the Earth registry file. The full entry, not just the classification summary." I did not say anything. I waited. She said, "Class 3 biosphere. Moderately competitive. Pre-expansion. Low threat." She paused. The full entry also contains a note from the survey team that completed the original classification assessment. The note is in the appendix, which most readers do not access. I said, "What does it say?" She said, "It says that the survey team observed, over a period of 6 months on the surface, that the dominant intelligent species on the planet demonstrated a level of environmental adaptation and problem-solving capacity that the standard classification rubric does not fully capture. The note recommends that the threat assessment be reviewed at the next scheduled interval." She glanced at me sideways. She said, "The next scheduled interval was 40 years after the original classification. The review was assigned to a department that was subsequently restructured, and the recommendation was never formally actioned." I said, "Bureaucracies are complicated." She said, "They are." We walked a few more steps in silence. Then she said, "I have been an investigator for 11 years. I have a reasonable ability to recognize when a situation has resolved itself into the cleanest possible outcome given the circumstances." I said, "That must be a useful ability." She said, "It is. It allows me to allocate my resources toward situations that have not yet resolved and that require active attention, rather than toward situations that are, in the most practical sense, finished." I looked at her. She was looking ahead, at the corridor, in the way that people look when they are saying something they are choosing their words for carefully. I said, "That sounds like a sensible approach to a demanding role." She said, "I think so." We reached the junction where her path and mine diverged. She continued straight. I would turn left, toward the academic wing and Instructor Hovey's xenobiology class, which started in 12 minutes. She said, without slowing or turning her head, "Earth. I think the registry has it wrong." I said, "A lot of people get it wrong." She said, "Yes. I imagine they find out eventually." She kept walking. I turned left. I stood at the turn for just a moment, watching her continue down the corridor. She did not look back. She walked the way she did everything, with the solid, unhurried presence of someone who has been in many rooms and is not surprised by what they find. She knew. I was certain she knew, in the way that an experienced investigator knows things that the evidence cannot prove. The interview, the questions, the note she had made on her recording device, and now this conversation, placed in the air not as accusation but as acknowledgement, a private recognition between two people that a thing had happened and that the outcome was what it was. What she would do with that knowing was the only remaining question, and she had answered it in the way she structured what she said. Resources toward situations that require active attention, situations that are, in the most practical sense, finished. She had closed it. Not officially. Officially it was already closed. But in the private accounting that a person of her experience keeps alongside the official record, she had closed it. Filed it in the category of things that resolved into the cleanest possible outcome given the circumstances, and moved on. I turned the corner and walked to xenobiology. Instructor Have was already at the front of the room when I arrived, arranging materials on her desk with the methodical efficiency of someone who has been doing this for many years, and has found the arrangement that works and sees no reason to change it. She did not look up when I entered. She does not look up when any student enters, because her attention is on her preparation until the bell tone signals the period beginning, at which point her attention shifts completely to the room and remains there until the end. I sat in my seat, 3rd row, center position. Good sightlines in every direction. The room filled around me. Ress came in and sat 2 rows back, where Ress always sits, and I heard the particular sound of Ress settling their materials on the desk, which is a sound I have come to know the way you come to know the sounds of anyone you spend regular time with. Tev came in and sat in the far corner, which is where Tev always sits, working from materials that seem to be only loosely connected to the course, and yet producing assessments that are consistently excellent, which is a mystery I have not yet solved but intend to. The bell tone sounded. Instructor Have looked up from her desk and her full attention came into the room like something switched on, complete and immediate. She said, "We are continuing the section on adaptive response systems in non-carbon-based biology. Before we do, I have returned the assessed papers from last week. The highest mark in the class went to a paper on Sci-Fi adaptive immunology that I have entered into the Institute archive." She looked at me, for 3 seconds instead of 2. Then she moved on. I opened my notebook. I picked up my writing instrument. I turned to a fresh page. Outside the viewport at the far end of the classroom, the stars were doing what they always do, which is to say they were burning steadily across distances that swallow anything small, including every event that ever happened on a station between 2 quiet stars, including 11 years of an investigator's experience, including whatever the registry survey team wrote in an appendix that nobody reads, including a decommissioned cargo bay in amber light and the weight of what it asked of me, and the stone I carry since. I have 2 years and 7 months remaining on my scholarship. I intend to use every day of them. I will go to my classes. I will do my work. I will sit with Rest 3 evenings a week and learn to read color wavelength communication, and arrive at jokes 4 seconds after everyone else, because that is simply how Rest works, and I would not change it. I will go to sub-level 9 when I need the particular silence of it, and I will sit against the far wall and think long thoughts in the amber light, and come back up the ladder, and through the hatch and into the ordinary world when I am ready. I will carry the weight the way you carry any weight. That is part of what the journey required, adjusted to, present but managed, going forward. And if anyone else at this institute, or on this station, or in any of the 31 species that share these corridors, decides that the Earth Registry classification tells them everything they need to know about the only human at the Galactic Preparatory Institute, and acts on that decision in the way that 3 students once acted on it after Advanced Systems class on a Tuesday afternoon, then I will do what I always do. I will pay attention, I will prepare, I will know the ground before I need it, and I will be ready. I am always ready. That is the most honest thing I know about myself, and about the species I come from, and about what 4.5 billion years on a world that does not ask permission before it tests you will do to the things that survive it. We are ready. All of us, all the time. The galaxy just has not fully updated its records yet. Instructor Hovey began to speak. I looked at her, and I listened, and I wrote down every word that mattered, in my small, careful handwriting, in my paper notebook, on a fresh page, on a station between 2 quiet stars, far from home and entirely, completely, unshakably here.